I came to the Oregon pines not to find myself, but to lose what was left of me. The memory of my son's body being pulled from the lake had turned every breath into a weight I could no longer carry. My grandfather had worked these remote forests 50 years ago, and I thought maybe the same trees that had given him purpose could grant me oblivion. I drove until the roads turned to mud, then walked until even the sound of my truck faded behind me. The forest here doesn't feel like other places. The ancient pines rise so tall, they seem to pierce something beyond the sky, their shadows cold and absolute, even at noon. I set up camp in a clearing my grandfather had marked on an old map, surrounded by trees older than the towns below, older than the wounds I carried. The silence here isn't empty. It listens. It waits. It remembers everything you're trying to forget. I thought solitude would be my cure. I thought if I could just disappear far enough into the wilderness, the grief would stay behind, like something I could outrun. But on my first night, as darkness poured down from the ridge, I heard it, 3 deep knocks echoing through the trees. Not the sound of an axe or falling timber, but something deliberate, rhythmic, impossibly heavy. Something in those mountains knew I had arrived, and whatever it was, it had been waiting. The next morning I walked into town for supplies, and that's when the elders found me. 3 Kalapuya men, faces carved by weather and time, waiting outside the trading post as if they'd known exactly when I'd arrive. The oldest one, his hair white as birch bark, studied me with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by a stranger's silence. He didn't ask why I'd come to the mountains alone, but he knew, the way you know a tree is dying from the inside before it falls. They spoke of the Ridgewalker in voices barely above a whisper, a name carried down through generations like a warning written in smoke. A guardian spirit, they said, tall as the ancient pines, who marks his territory by shattering trees with his bare hands. No axe, no blade, only impossible strength and older-than-memory rage. He punishes those who take without asking, who enter the forest with greed or disrespect, who believe the wilderness owes them anything at all. The eldest gripped my wrist with fingers like iron and said the words that would haunt me. Never cross the ridge after sunset. I told them I wasn't afraid of legends, that I'd come here to be alone, that whatever lived in those mountains couldn't hurt me worse than I'd already been hurt. But the old man didn't let go, his eyes boring into mine with something beyond concern, recognition maybe, or pity for what he saw coming. He said the Ridgewalker doesn't hunt the arrogant or the greedy most of all, but those carrying the kind of grief that makes them careless with their own lives. I left town with their warning coiled in my chest like smoke, trying to convince myself they were just old stories meant to keep outsiders away. But that night, back at my camp, I heard the knocking again, 3 strikes, closer than before. Coming from the ridge they'd told me never to cross, and I realized with cold certainty that whatever waited up there had heard every word of our conversation, and knew I would eventually come. I found the clearing 3 days later, and it stole the breath from my lungs like a fist to the chest. 14 enormous pines lay shattered in a perfect circle, each trunk as thick as a truck tire, splintered and twisted as though crushed by hands strong enough to wring water from stone. There were no axe marks, no saw cuts, no machinery tracks in the soft earth, only the terrible geometry of destruction that spoke of something beyond human capability. The air itself felt different here, heavy and watchful, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to understand. I walked the circumference slowly, my logger's eye searching for explanation and finding only impossibility. The trees hadn't been felled. They'd been broken at chest height, the wood fibers compressed and mangled in patterns that defied everything I knew about timber and force and physics. Some trunks were twisted like wet rope, spiraling in directions that made my stomach turn. I knelt and ran my fingers over the shattered wood, still faintly warm despite the morning cold, and felt the first real tremor of fear crack through the numb armor I'd worn since the funeral. This wasn't random destruction or natural disaster. It was deliberate, precise, a message written in broken giants for anyone foolish enough to read it. The circle was too perfect, the spacing too intentional, each tree chosen and destroyed with what could only be called ceremony. I thought of my grandfather's stories about the old forests, about places where the land itself could speak if you were quiet enough to listen, and I finally understood that silence and speech were not opposites, but the same terrible language. As I stood in the center of that shattered cathedral, surrounded by evidence of power I couldn't comprehend, I felt something shift inside my chest where grief had calcified into stone. Whatever made this clearing hadn't destroyed these trees out of rage, it had broken them the way my son's death had broken me, completely and without mercy, leaving only the question of what grows back in the empty spaces. The knocking began on the fourth night. 3 deep strikes that rolled through the forest like distant thunder, so low I felt them in my ribs before I heard them with my ears. I sat up in my tent, breath frozen, listening to the silence that followed, a silence so complete it felt like the woods themselves had stopped to listen. The sound came from the ridge, unmistakable and deliberate, and though every instinct screamed danger, some deeper part of me recognized it as language, as invitation, as the first word spoken in a conversation I didn't yet know I was having. Each evening after, the pattern repeated. 3 strikes at dusk, always measured, always patient, drawing incrementally closer like a careful approach to a wounded animal. I began to wait for it, sitting outside my tent with coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the shadows lengthen between the pines. On the 7th night, the knocking came from less than 100 yards away, and I found myself responding without thinking. 3 strikes of my axe against a fallen log. The same rhythm, the same spacing, an answer carved from instinct and something like desperate hope. The forest held its breath. Then, impossibly, came 4 knocks in reply. 3 familiar strikes followed by 1 different, softer, almost questioning. My hands trembled as I struck 4 times myself, adding my own variation, and heard the pattern echoed back with what I can only describe as recognition. We were speaking, this presence and I, building a bridge across the dark, with nothing but rhythm and repetition. That night I understood. Grief had made me fluent in the language of things that dwell beyond words, in the vocabulary of loss that transcends species and time. I found the prints on the 8th morning, pressed deep into the mud beside the stream, where I'd washed my face just hours before in darkness. Each finger was thick as my forearm, the palm broader than my chest, the depth suggesting a weight that should have shaken the ground beneath my sleeping bag. It had stood there watching me through the canvas walls, close enough to hear my breathing, close enough to reach out and touch, and had chosen stillness instead of violence, observation instead of judgment. My hands shook as I knelt beside those impossible impressions, tracing the ridges with trembling fingers, feeling the reality of something that shouldn't exist, pressing back against everything I thought I knew about the world. This was no bear, no elk, no creature catalogued in any field guide. The proportions spoke of something that walked upright, something with intention behind its movements, something that had been measuring me night after night while I slept vulnerable and unaware. Terror should have driven me down the mountain, back to trucks and telephones and the comfortable lies of civilization. Instead, I felt a strange recognition, an understanding that whatever made, these prints knew about watching and waiting, about the long vigil grief demands. It had been studying my solitude with the patience of something that had witnessed 1,000 human sorrows, deciding whether I was ready for what lay beyond the ridge. That evening I packed light, left my axe behind, and turned my face toward the forbidden boundary. As twilight bled between the trees, the ridge broke open into a stand of ancient cedars, and there, backlit by the dying sun, it stood waiting. 8 feet of impossible reality, shoulders broad as a doorway, covered in dark fur that seemed woven from shadow and bark. But it was the eyes that stopped my heart, amber and ageless, carrying a weight of Sorrow so vast, it made my grief feel like a single raindrop in an endless ocean. It did not move with aggression, but with the careful deliberacy of something that understood the fragility of this moment. One massive hand rose slowly, palm outward, a gesture older than language, not threat, invitation, the 3 knocking sounds I'd heard each. Night. They came from its chest now, a rhythmic drumming that resonated in my bones, calling me forward into territory where logic dissolved and older truths remained. I should have run. Instead, I followed as it turned and moved deeper into the wilderness, each footfall silent despite its mass, branches parting as if the forest itself recognized its keeper. We walked through twilight, turning to darkness, and still I felt no fear, only the strange certainty that I was being led toward something I'd been searching for since the day I held my son's soaked clothing and knew he would never come home. The Ridgewalker moved like grief itself, ancient, patient, and utterly certain of its destination, and I followed because some part of me understood that whatever waited ahead would either destroy me completely or teach me how to survive the breaking. The grove appeared without warning, a perfect circle of stones older than memory, and at its center, a pool of water so still it reflected stars that hadn't yet appeared in the sky. The Ridgewalker stopped at the threshold and gestured toward the water with one enormous hand. I approached on trembling legs, and as I looked into those impossible depths, the surface rippled without wind or touch. Images began to form in water that suddenly felt older than the mountains themselves. I saw my son, not drowning but laughing, running through these very trees in a time before roads or towns existed, when the forest was everything, and the boundary between worlds was thin as morning mist. I saw him welcomed by the green shadows, held by something vast and gentle that I'd never had words to name. The Ridgewalker's deep rumble spoke without language. The forest keeps what belongs to it, remembers what others forget, holds safe what was never truly lost. Tears came then, not the hollow grief that had carved me empty, but something deeper and strangely clean. The creature's massive hand rested briefly on my shoulder, and in that touch I felt centuries of guardianship, of watching humans take and forget, the reciprocal nature of existence. My son hadn't been stolen. He'd been received. The forest had claimed one of its own, as it had always done, as it always would. The Ridgewalker turned toward me fully, and I understood. Some are taken, but some are chosen to carry the knowledge back. The Ridgewalker reached toward the ancient trees surrounding us, and with movements impossibly gentle for something so massive, began peeling bark from a fallen giant. Its clawed fingers worked with precision that spoke of countless years, shaping the wood into something I couldn't yet comprehend. I watched those enormous hands create beauty from destruction, and understood this was how the forest itself operated, breaking down, building up, transforming death into continuation. The creature's eyes met mine, and in their amber depths I saw reflected every human who had ever stood at this threshold, faced with the same terrible choice. It extended the carved token toward me, a spiral cut so deep it seemed to hold shadows within shadows, a pattern that hurt to follow but impossible to look away from. This was the covenant, I realized. Carry the grief, but let it transform. Speak the truth of what the forest is, even when others mock or forget. Become the interpreter between what was and what must be. The weight of it crushed my chest, heavier than any log I'd ever shouldered, because this burden wouldn't end when I set it down. This one I'd carry until my own threshold came. The Ridgewalker's rumble filled the grove one final time, a sound like roots breaking through stone, patient and inevitable. I felt the knowledge settle into my bones, not given but earned through the breaking. My son's name rose in my throat, and for the first time since the drowning, it didn't taste like drowning itself. I took the token with shaking hands, and the ancient guardian faded back into the trees like morning mist. The spiral in my palm seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, And suddenly I understood what the circle of shattered trees truly meant. The Ridgewalker hadn't destroyed those giants in rage. It had broken them the way grief had broken me, completely and without mercy. But the forest floor around them had exploded with new growth, saplings reaching toward light that hadn't touched that ground in centuries. Destruction wasn't the end of their story, just the violent middle chapter that made the next one possible. I thought of all the months I'd spent trying to hold myself together, terrified that if I broke completely, I'd never be whole again. But wholeness wasn't what I needed. It was transformation, the brutal replanting that only comes after the old growth falls. My son's name, Thomas, finally crossed my lips without the weight of ocean water. Just the clean truth of a life that mattered, a love that remained even after the body was gone. The Ridgewalker had shown me what I couldn't see through the grief. You don't survive loss by staying intact. The ancient guardian was gone now, absorbed back into the wilderness like breath into wind. But the grove still hummed with its presence, with the presence of everyone and everything the forest had witnessed and held. I pressed the token against my chest, feeling its spiral edge bite through my shirt, a pain that felt like waking up. I turned toward the ridge, toward the world I'd fled, ready now to return as something new. The drive back took 3 days, but I measured the distance. Differently now, not in miles, but in breaths, in moments when Thomas's laugh echoed in memory without tearing me open. The token stayed in my pocket, its spiral grooves worn smooth by my thumb, a reminder that some things must be touched constantly to stay real. I stopped at the Kalapuya reservation before leaving, said nothing about what I'd seen, but the elders looked at me with knowing eyes. One grandmother simply nodded and whispered that the forest sends people back when they're finally ready to be among the living. I returned to the coastal town I'd abandoned, to the house that still smelled like salt, and my son's favorite cinnamon cereal. His room remained untouched, a shrine I'd been too broken to enter, but now I walked through that door and opened the windows, letting Oregon wind move through the stagnant grief. I didn't pack his things away. That felt like erasure, but I let them exist as memory rather than wound. Objects that held love instead of only loss. People noticed the change without understanding it. I started working with the harbor's search and rescue volunteers, helping other families navigate the impossible aftermath of water taking what it shouldn't. I never mentioned the Ridgewalker, but I carried its lesson in every conversation. You honor the lost by continuing, by breaking open and growing different. The forest had given me back my son's name, and in exchange I became what the Ridgewalker had always been, a threshold keeper standing between grief and transformation, showing others that breaking isn't dying. It's just the necessary shattering before you grow toward light again. What would you cross into darkness to find? Subscribe to Walk Between Worlds with us.